The city of Houston sprawls under a pale morning sky, glass towers catching the first light, highways already humming, an airport alive with the machinery of people going somewhere that matters. One terminal, one gate, one man standing in a boarding line like he has done 1,000 times before, briefcase in hand. Tie straight, eyes forward. He has $95 million ready to sign over to the airline whose plane he is about to board. He does not know that someone on that plane has already made a decision about him, not about his money, not about his company, about his seat. The gate door opens, the jetway stretches ahead, and somewhere in the cabin beyond, a phone call has already been made. An instruction already given, a man already waiting. The boarding pass says 1A. It will not stay that way. The man who was about to write Falcon Air a $95 million check was sitting in the back of a Baltimore cab at 4:47 in the morning, watching the city he grew up in slide past the window in the dark. Not because he had to leave this early, because he couldn't sleep. Elliot Hayes, 44 years old, CEO of Pinnacle Capital. $4.2 billion in assets under management. A company he'd built from 4 employees and 1 client into something that made people in boardrooms across the country lean forward in their chairs. And tonight, like most nights before something mattered, he'd lain flat on his back in the dark and stared at a ceiling he couldn't see and thought about a number. $95 million. 14 months of work, 14 months of flights and calls and revisions and more calls. 14 months of being the most prepared person in every room and having to prove it before anyone would even look up from their papers. He'd given up on sleep at 4:15. Showered, dressed, stood in front of the bathroom mirror with his half nodded and looked at himself the way his mother had taught him to when he was 12 years old. Not checking his teeth, not fixing his hair, just looking, squares in the eyes. She used to say it every morning before school. Look at yourself first, before the world does. He finished the knot, picked up his bag, checked his watch, called a cab. The city moved past him in the gray dark. West Baltimore first, Edmondson Avenue, the neighborhood where he'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment, where the first thing you learned was how to read a room. Who was safe? Which streets you crossed and which ones you didn't, not because someone told you, but because you paid attention, and paying attention kept you whole. Then the harbor, then the tunnel, then the airport road, and the lights of BWI coming into focus through the windshield. His phone showed 1 missed call from a Baltimore area code. His mother, Dorothy Hayes, 71 years old, still up before sunrise out of habit, even though the night shifts at Johns Hopkins were 20 years behind her. He called her back before he got out of the cab. She picked up on the second ring. "You're already awake," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Good." A pause. The sound of her chair shifting means you care. "Mom, don't overthink it. You know these numbers better than anyone in that room." Her voice was calm, certain in the way that only people who have seen a lot of uncertainty can be certain. "Call me when it's done." "I will." He held the phone a second longer than he needed to. Then he got out of the cab and walked into the terminal. He'd grown up in West Baltimore. His father left when Elliot was 8. Dorothy worked nights and slept days and never said a word about either. He did his homework under the kitchen light while she slept. They had a system. It worked. He was 12 when he decided he wanted to understand money, not make it. Understand it. There was a difference. Making money was what people did. Understanding it was something else. He started reading the business section of the newspaper his teacher threw away on Fridays. Didn't understand half of it. Read it anyway. Johns Hopkins on a partial scholarship. 4 years of being the wrong shape for the container everyone else fit into. He graduated anyway. Top of his class. Not to prove a point, because he was genuinely the best student there, and the grades reflected it. Wharton for his MBA, 12 years on Onsell Street. Every room a slight variation on the same dynamic. He walks in. Expectations adjust down. He opens his mouth. They adjust back up, slowly, never all the way, just enough to keep the conversation going. He launched Pinnacle Capital 9 years ago with 4 employees and 1 client who believed in him before the numbers gave anyone reason to. Now he had 180 employees, 40% of them minorities he'd recruited personally, called them himself, sat across from them and told them what nobody had told him at their age. "You belong here. Now show them why." Pinnacle's specialty was domestic transportation infrastructure. roads, rail, airports. The unglamorous backbone of a country that moved things from one place to another and needed people willing to do the math on it. Falcon Air was the biggest deal he'd ever chased. A regional airline with solid roots, aging aircraft, and a balance sheet that needed surgery. He'd spent 14 months performing that surgery in his head before he ever picked up a phone. He knew their debt structure, their lease obligations, their route efficiency numbers, their maintenance backlogs. He knew them better than some of their own executives did. The deal was $95 million. Performance benchmarks and ESG targets built into the structure. If Falcon Air hit those targets in 18 months, the number climbed to $140 million. He designed it that way deliberately. Not just investment, partnership, accountability baked into every clause. He was good at this. Technically, structurally, fundamentally good at this. Today, he was going to walk into their headquarters in Houston and prove it. He boarded his connecting flight to Houston, settled into the seat, opened his laptop, started reading. Flight 2241 to Houston departed at 7:50. Elliot had booked seat 1A 3 weeks earlier. Not to make a statement, because he needed to work. 3 hours of flight time was 3 hours of review, 3 hours of breathing and preparing and arriving ready. He always flew up front on travel days that mattered, not a luxury, a work decision. He reached the gate at 6:40, found a seat by the window, and opened his laptop. Pulled up the Falcon Air presentation one more time, not because he didn't know it, because ritual mattered, because his hands needed something to do before a day like this one. At 6:55, first-class boarding was called. He folded the laptop, picked up his briefcase, joined the short line, showed his boarding pass at the scanner. The gate agent glanced at it, glanced at him, looked back at her screen for just a half-second longer than she needed to. Elliot noticed. He always noticed. Didn't say anything, took his pass back, walked down the jetway, seat 1A, forwardmost window seat on the left side. He stowed his bag, settled in, arranged his materials, asked for coffee when the flight attendant came by. She brought it without making eye contact. His name was on the manifest. His boarding pass was valid. His ticket had been purchased 3 weeks ago at full fare. None of that was visible. But somehow, in this seat, on this morning, Elliot Hayes felt the weight of being seen as something that didn't quite fit. He opened his presentation and started reading. Her name was Brenda Walsh, 34 years old, 11 years with Falcon Air. She'd worked her way up from regional routes to the premium cabin, which was considered the best assignment. Quietest passengers, most consistent schedules. She had a daughter named Cora, 9 years old, loved horses, and had recently decided she wanted to be a meteorologist, which Brenda thought was wonderful and a little random. Brenda was genuinely good at her job. She remembered passenger preferences without being asked. She managed difficult people without making them feel managed. She had a kind of quiet efficiency that showed up consistently in feedback surveys. She was already in the premium cabin when Conrad Hale found her. He pulled her aside near the galley, spoke low, calm, the way someone gives a routine operational note. "We have a situation," he said. "Seat 1A, the passenger needs to be verified carefully. Take your time with it. We have a VIP boarding shortly who'll need accommodation." Brenda looked at him. "His boarding pass is valid?" Conrad's expression didn't change, just be thorough. She would replay that exchange many times in the weeks that followed. Would turn it over. Would try to find a version of it that meant something different than what it meant. She wouldn't find one. Conrad walked back up the jetway. Brenda stood in the galley for a moment, smoothed her jacket, walked into the cabin. Conrad Hale was 58 years old and had worked in aviation his entire adult life. His grandfather flew cargo planes in the 1940s. His father managed regional airports through the deregulation era of the 80s. Conrad had joined Falcon Air at 26 as a ground operations coordinator and worked his ways up over 32 years to vice president of operations. Oversight of everything that happened between a passenger booking a ticket and that passenger walking off the aircraft. He was not a stupid man. He was not in his own mind a cruel one. He genuinely believed in operational standards, in what he called brand culture, in the idea that certain environments required a certain kind of consistency to function. He had spent 32 years building Falcon Air's texture, and he was protective of it the way someone is protective of something built with their own hands. When Elliot Hayes first appeared in discussions about potential investment partners, Conrad had read the Pinnacle Capital profile and felt what he called professional skepticism. He would not have called it what it actually was. What he knew was that a firm led by someone like Elliot Hayes gaining governance rights over Falcon Air, ethics committee access, board visibility, the ability to shape consultancy, made his jaw tighten in a way he couldn't explain to himself clearly enough to examine. He told himself it was about fit. He told himself a lot of things. Then his phone buzzed. Preston Ashford, calling from the gate. Preston was 55. Old money that had long ago stopped thinking of itself as money and started thinking of itself as simply the condition of the world. He sat on 4 corporate boards. He golfed on Thursdays. He had been Conrad's closest friend for 20 years in the way that men of a certain background become friends, through proximity and shared assumptions, and never having to explain themselves to each other. "I'm in economy," Preston said. The words came out like he'd been asked to sit in a ditch. "I know. It's handled. Conrad, it's handled." Conrad hung up, looked down the jetway at the plane. Thought about Elliot Hayes sitting in seat 1A with a briefcase full of documents that could reshape the airline Conrad had spent his career building. Told himself it was about fit. Walked away. Brenda approached Elliot for the first time at 7:02. "Boarding pass, sir?" Elliot looked up from his laptop, held it out. Calm. The way you are when you've done this 1,000 times. "Good morning." She took it, studied it longer than she'd studied anyone else's. He watched her eyes move across it twice. "And your name is?" "Elliot Hayes." "And you're certain this is the correct seat?" He pulled out his phone, showed her the booking confirmation. "Seat 1A highlighted in blue, 3 weeks ago. Full fare, his name." She handed it back. "Thank you, sir." Her voice was professional, not hostile, just stripped down to its function. She moved on without offering the pre-boarding beverage she'd already given the 2 passengers across the aisle. Elliot turned back to his laptop, didn't say anything, didn't shift in his seat, just noted it, filed it, kept reading. 7 minutes later, she was back. "I'm sorry to bother you again, sir. The system is showing some confusion with the seat assignment. Could I see your boarding pass one more time?" "Certainly." He held it out without looking up from his screen. She held it for a long moment, looked at it, looked at him, looked back. "Thank you," she said finally. "Sorry for the inconvenience." She handed it back and walked away. Elliot put it in his breast pocket, went back to his presentation. He'd been flying first class for 12 years. Nobody had ever asked to see his boarding pass twice. He already knew a 3rd time was coming. He was right. Preston Ashford came down the jetway at 7:09 with the energy of a man who had never once in his adult life been inconvenienced without someone correcting it immediately. His carry-on was monogrammed. His face was the deep red of someone who had been told, wrongly and outrageously, that his table wasn't ready. He paused at the entrance to the first-class cabin, looked at the seats, looked at Elliot. Something passed across his face. He pulled out his phone, typed something, put it away, walked to the front of the cabin without sitting down. 2 minutes later, Conrad appeared at the aircraft door. They spoke quietly near the galley. Elliot could see them without turning his head, could see the angle of Conrad's chin towards seat 1A, the brief dismissive gesture, the nod. He didn't need to hear the words. He'd seen this before. Not on an airplane conference rooms, in hotel lobbies, in the particular calculation that sometimes came over a room when Elliot walked into it. Not surprise exactly, but a reassessment. The silent question of whether someone had made an error. He took a slow breath. Here we go. Brenda came to him a 3rd time at 7:12. Her voice was lower now. "Careful. Sir, I'm sorry to do this. We have a situation with a VIP passenger who requires this specific seat. We're able to accommodate you in economy with full compensation and a travel voucher." Elliot set his laptop down, slowly, looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly a second before Zaz moved slightly left. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," he said. I have could do during this flight." "I understand that, sir. Is there something wrong with seat 3C? He gestured toward the empty aisle seat 2 rows back, or 2B. Brenda opened her mouth, closed it. Preston stepped forward from the front of the cabin. "Because some of us," he said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who had never once needed to lower it in a room, "actually belong here." The cabin went silent, not the polite silence of people pretending not to listen, the real kind, the held breath kind. When something has been said that can't be unsaid and everyone in earshot knows it. Elliot didn't look at Preston. He looked at Brenda. She looked back at him with something that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't cruelty, but was harder than either. It was the face of someone who knows what's happening and is doing it anyway, because the weight of not doing it feels heavier. He would remember that look. Later, when it mattered, he would remember it exactly. A flight supervisors appeared from near the galley. Then, at the cabin entrance, 2 uniformed security officers, hands at their sides, watching. "Sir," the supervisor said, "we need to ask you to relocate to accommodate our priority passenger." Priority passenger. Elliot's voice was steady. "He has a first-class ticket for this flight?" A pause. "Mr. Ashford is a long-standing premium member of our. Does he have a first-class ticket for this flight?" Longer pause. Elliot stood. He moved slowly, picked up his laptop, his materials, his briefcase, folded his reading glasses into his breast pocket. All of it deliberate. All of it unhurried. The act of a man who had decided exactly how he was going to conduct himself in this moment and was following through with precision. He looked at Brenda. "Your name," he said, not loud, not angry. "And your badge number, please," she told him. Barely audible, he noted both in his phone, then noted the supervisor's name, then looked at the security officers and noted theirs. Conrad Hale stood near the galley entrance, watching. He had the careful expression of someone whose plan was unfolding as intended. Elliot looked at him for a long moment. Conrad didn't look away, neither did Elliot. Then Elliot turned and walked. Straight and slow through the first-class cabin, past the passengers who had suddenly become very interested in their window shades. Through the curtain, through business class, through the boundary and into economy, where the air was warmer and the ceiling was lower, and the world compressed itself into a little seat in row 31. Preston Ashford settled into 1A. Conrad turned back to the galley, and 3 passengers on 3 separate phones finished recording. Aboard Flight 2241, Economy Cabin Row 31. Seat B middle. The window passenger pressed herself against the glass. The aisle passenger's elbow claimed the armrest before Elliot had even sat down. His knees hit the seat back in front of him. The overhead vent was broken. The cabin, even this early, was noticeably warmer than the forward section. He loosened his tie exactly 1/4 of an inch. No more. He worked his laptop out of his briefcase in the compressed space. Took nearly a minute, got it open and pulled up his presentation. The Wi-Fi signal in economy was weak, too weak to refresh the market data he needed. He worked from what he had, which was most of it. Enough of it. At 7:50, the plane pushed back from the gate. At 8:04 airborne, his phone buzzed. Luggage alert. Itinerary update detected. He tapped it. His checked bag, containing the printed contract documents, the backup binder, and the change of clothes he'd planned to wear into the boardroom, had been rerouted. Current destination, Charlotte Douglas International. He stared at that for a long time, not because it surprised him, because he was deciding something. He opened his voice memo app, started recording. Time 8:24 a.m., Flight 2241. Seat 1A to economy, row 31. Names and badge numbers of crew involved. Preston Ashford. Conrad Hale, observed at galley. Luggage rerouted. Destination Charlotte. No explanations provided. He listed every detail in the order it happened. Clear, organized, time-stamped, his mother's voice somewhere in the back of his mind. When they go low, you document everything. The man across the aisle, gray fleece, window seat, had been holding his phone at an angle since before Elliot sat down. Their eyes met briefly. The man gave the smallest possible nod. Elliot turned back to his work. At 8:40, he asked for water. The flight attendant brought a half-filled plastic cup, sloshed some onto his laptop while setting it down, moved on without looking back. He dried the screen with a napkin, kept working. An hour into the flight, voices drifted from the galley behind him. 2 crew members, not quite as quiet as they thought they were. Wellington said to make sure he doesn't get comfortable. Who's Wellington? The VP, that Conrad, sorry. He and the guy in 1A go way back, country club. Elliot recorded that too. The man across the aisle leaned over once, quietly. I got the whole thing on video, from when they first came to his seat. He paused. Elliot looked at him. Thank you, was said. The man nodded, turned back to his window. The plane flew on. At 10:08, beginning its descent into Houston, Elliot's phone showed a notification from the news monitoring app his team had installed on all executive devices. He almost never checked it mid-flight. He checked it now, a video, 28 seconds, shot from 2 rows behind seat 1A, slightly shaky but clear. Clear enough to see Elliot standing unhurried in the aisle. Clear enough to hear Preston Ashford's voice. Clear enough to see the security officers at the cabin entrance with their hands at their sides. Clear enough to see Conrad Hale in the galley background, watching. The video had been posted 41 minutes ago, 420,000 views. He looked at that number, put the phone in his pocket, went back to the presentation he'd been reviewing when Brenda Walsh first approached him. His COO Renee Albright had texted, "Don't cancel anything. Call me after Wheels Down." His lawyer Owen Garrett had texted, "Watching this. Stand by." Dr. Elton Briggs, his mentor, a man who had known Elliot since Wharton and understood exactly what this moment cost, had sent one word: proud. Elliot read each message. Replied to none. He needed to focus. The wheels touched down at 10:05 a.m. Elliot sat in his seat while the cabin emptied around him. Not paralyzed, not emotional. Deciding. The way he decided everything that mattered, precisely, with the full weight of what was at stake on one side and what was possible on the other. What had happened this morning was real. Documented, spreading. And it was going to walk into the Falcon Air boardroom with him whether he wanted it to or not. So he could be angry. Lord knows he had every right. Or he could be strategic. He picked up his briefcase, stood, walked off the plane, through the jetway, out into the Houston terminal, and stood for a moment in the bright airport light, in a suit that was slightly wrinkled. Without the materials he'd packed, without the backup clothes he'd planned to wear, with 400,000 people having now seen exactly how Falcon Air treated the man who was about to write them the largest check of their history. He called Renee. "I need everything on Conrad Hale," he said. "Employment history, internal complaints, reviews, everything filed and buried. Everything." "Already started," she said. Good." He flagged a cab. He had a meeting to get to. In the cab, with Houston sliding past the windows and the driver playing something low on the radio, Elliot let himself sit with it. Just for the length of one cab ride, the weight of walking that aisle, the familiar, specific, bone-deep weight of being moved, of being removed, not with violence, with procedure, with apologies and vouchers, and the careful language of rules that appeared and disappeared depending on who was sitting where. He had felt versions of this weight his whole adult life, a receptionist's double-take, a colleague's assumption, an investor's pause before deciding he was worth their time. This was the bluntest version he'd ever encountered, and somehow, he turned this over carefully, somehow also the most clarifying. Because Conrad Hale had made a calculation this morning, had looked at Elliot Hayes in seat 1A and decided that Preston Ashford's comfort was worth more. Had decided that whatever Elliot represented, whatever disruption to Conrad's understanding of how things should go, needed to be corrected before it got any further. He had made that choice, and now Elliot was going to make one. The cab pulled up to the Falcon Air Tower. 37 floors of glass catching the Houston morning sun. The company logo in blue and silver, polished, aspirational. Elliot paid, got out, straightened his jacket, looked up at the building for exactly 2 seconds, breathed in. Inside the lobby, he walked past the security desk without slowing. Marble floors, art on the walls chosen to communicate expense, reception desks staffed by 2 people whose job was to assess visitors before they finished crossing the threshold. The receptionist looked up, looked at him, and did it. The half-second recalibration. Elliot didn't slow down. "Elliot Hayes," he said. "CEO, Pinnacle Capital, 2 o'clock with the executive team." She typed, looked at her screen, typed again. "Of course, Hayes, a beat too long. I'll let them know you've arrived." He stood at the desk, didn't sit, didn't look at his phone. Just stood there with his briefcase and his wrinkled suit and the full weight of what had happened that morning sitting quietly in his chest. 3 minutes. 4. The elevator opened, and Gerald Morrow walked out with the expression of a man who had been watching a fire spread for the last 2 hours and was hoping the handshake could contain it. Gerald was 62, silver-haired. 9 years running Falcon Air, which in the airline industry counted as survival. He crossed the lobby with his hand already extended. Elliot, warm, urgent. The warmth of a man doing aggressive repair work. I'm so sorry for Annie. We've been expecting you, please. Gerald. Elliot shook the hand. Firm, brief. Good to finally be here. Behind Gerald, stepping from the same elevator with the posture of a man trying to look relaxed, Conrad Hale. Conrad extended his hand. Elliot shook it. 1 second of silence between them. Elliot, Conrad said. What an unfortunate morning. Not at all, Elliot said. Interesting flight. That was the whole conversation. Everything that needed to be said between them had already been said, 30,000 feet over Texas. The rest was performance they both had to get through. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in together. Elliot looked straight ahead. 37th floor. He had a presentation to deliver, and nobody was going to move him. Falcon Air Headquarters, 37th floor. The conference room had windows that looked out over Houston like the city was a resource to be managed. Long table, 12 chairs. Executive team already seated when Elliot walked, CFO to 2 board observers, legal counsel, and at the far end, Margaret Doyle. 59 years old. 8 years on Falcon Air's board. She looked up when he entered with an expression that was harder to read than everyone else's. Not the careful damage control face the others were wearing. Not apology, not relief. Something more watchful. Like someone who had been waiting to see what kind of man walked through that door and was now making her assessment. Elliot noted it, held it, sat down. He set his briefcase on the table, opened it, pulled out his laptop. No printed materials because his printed materials were currently in Charlotte Douglas Airport waiting for nobody. Nobody mentioned this. Nobody was going to. He began. 47 minutes. No notes, no prompts, no document in front of him. Just the numbers, which he knew the way musicians know songs they've played for years. Not from the page anymore, but from somewhere deeper. Falcon Air's debt structure, lease obligations on their regional fleet, route efficiency ratios on their top 14 corridors, maintenance backlog costs and the 3-year projection if the backlog continued growing at its current rate, fuel hedging exposure, labor contract renewals coming up in 18 months. He talked about each one in sequence, showed his work on the laptop screen, answered questions before they were fully formed. When their CFO started to interject about a discrepancy in maintenance projection, Elliot already had the source document open. He talked about infrastructure, the way other people talked about things that they'd built themselves, with precision, with care, with the quiet authority of someone who had done the work with Thorne and knew the difference between knowing something and understanding it. Halfway through, he noticed the CFO had stopped taking notes and was just listening. That was always the moment. The room stopped assessing and started actually hearing. He'd learned to recognize it years ago. Learned to let it happen without acknowledging it. Because acknowledging it broke the spell. When he finished, he closed his laptop, looked around the table. I'll need to revisit a few clauses in the term sheet before we proceed, he said. My team will be in touch by end of week. He looked at Gerald. Gerald had the expression of a man who had spent the last 2 hours expecting a confrontation and was now recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the person sitting across from him. Of course, Gerald said. Absolutely. Yes. Elliot began packing his laptop. Margaret Doyle spoke for the first time. Mr. Hayes. Her voice was level, not performative, not the practiced warmth of someone managing a situation, just direct. I have one question, if you'll allow it. The room shifted slightly. Conrad, standing near the windows, went still. Of course, Elliot said. The presentation you just gave, from memory without materials, was that always the plan? Or did something happen this morning that made it necessary? The room went very quiet. Elliot looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without any of the discomfort the others were carrying. Both, he said. She nodded, once, slowly. As if that answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. Nobody else said anything. Elliot packed his laptop, stood, shook hands around the table, thanked each person by name, moved toward the door and paused, just at the threshold, turned back as if he'd almost forgotten something minor. One thing before I go. The room went still, not gradually, all at once. The passenger removed from seat 1A this morning on flight 2241 to accommodate a non-ticketed first-class guest. He said it in exactly the same jitter he'd used for the debt structure and the maintenance projections. Level. Unhurried. That was me. The CFO stopped breathing visibly. The legal counsel picked up her pen and put it back down without writing anything. Two of the board observers looked at each other and then immediately regretted that they had. Margaret Doyle did not look at anyone else in the room. She kept her eyes on Elliot, and in her face was something he registered clearly and filed away. Not surprise. Recognition. The expression of someone who had been waiting for a thing to become visible that she had known was there. Gerald's face did something complicated. Conrad, standing near the windows, went to stone. "I wanted you to know," Elliot continued, "because how this company responds in the next few days will shape how I think about this partnership going forward." He looked at Gerald specifically, held it for exactly 1 beat. "My team will be in touch." He walked out. The elevator was waiting. He got in. The doors closed. The floor numbers counted down. He looked straight ahead and said nothing and let himself breathe. Outside in the Houston afternoon, Elliot stood on the sidewalk and called Renee. "How bad is it?" he said. Define bad. The sound of her moving, her keyboard, the rhythm of Renee in full operational mode, fast, focused, no wasted motion. The video is at 1.9 million views, trending in 8 states. Journalists from the Journal, the Post, and 3 local Houston outlets have called our main line. A civil rights organization out of Atlanta issued a statement an hour ago. What's the statement say? That they're monitoring the situation and calling for Falcon Air to respond publicly. A pause, which they haven't. Not yet. They will. He started walking. What else? Conrad Hale. Renee's voice shifted. She'd moved from situation update to intelligence briefing, which meant she'd found something. 32 years at Falcon Air. In that time, 4 formal discrimination complaints filed against employees under his direct operational oversight. All 4 settled. All 4 under NDA. Do we have the names of the complainants? 2 former employees contacted us through the general inbox this morning after seeing the video. They recognize the pattern. They want to talk. Set it up. Through Owen, so it's protected. He paused at the corner, waiting for the light. Clear Path Analytics. Ahead of you. Conrad has used them 3 times in 4 years for what Falcon Air internally calls competitive intelligence work. 2 of ClearPath's former contractors have been named in civil suits involving unauthorized system access in the last 18 months. Elliot looked up at the Falcon Air tower behind him. 37 floors of glass reflecting clouds. He's going to try to access our systems, he said. If he hasn't already started, lock everything down, full security audit by tomorrow morning, and activate the honeypot. I want decoy files in place before end of day. Real enough to look valuable. Traceable enough to tell us exactly where they go. Already on it, Renee said. And she sounded almost satisfied. Owen has been reviewing the MAC clause all morning. His read is that we're on solid ground. The material adverse change provision in the preliminary agreement requires first good faith conduct from both parties throughout the negotiation period. Conrad's actions and the documented luggage reroute give us a credible argument that Falcon Air breached that requirement. So we suspend, not reverse. Correct. The $25 million that already transferred sits in escrow pending dispute resolution. They can't touch it while the clause is active. And we don't resume payments until an independent review is complete. The light changed. He crossed. Owen files the formal notice to their legal team tomorrow at 9 a.m. Elliot said, not a minute earlier. I want them to have had a full night to watch the video numbers climb first. Understood. A brief pause. Elliot, yeah, the stock. Tell me. Down 9% from open. He let that sit for half a block. Okay, he said. He hung up. Flagged a cab back to the hotel. Sat in the back seat and watched Houston go by and thought about the 32 years of Conrad Hale. It's something he called a culture and what it cost to maintain it, and who had been paying that cost all along. Conrad Hale spent the afternoon of that same day doing something he was very good at, managing. Not in the operational sense, though he was good at that too. In the other sense, the quieter one. Where you make calls to the right people in the right order and the shape of a situation changes without anyone being able to identify exactly when or how. He called Preston Ashford first. Preston was at his club by mid-afternoon. Conrad could hear it in the background, that muffled, insulated quiet of a room designed to keep the outside world from pressing in. The sound of old leather chairs and low voices and a ceiling high enough that nothing echoed. It's getting complicated, Conrad said. I saw the video. Everyone's seen the video. What do you need? Conrad thought about it. Not long. He'd already been thinking about it since the moment Elliot had paused in the doorway of the conference room and turned back. Since the moment he'd understood that Elliot Hayes had walked out of that meeting without raising his voice, without threatening anyone, without doing a single thing that could be called unprofessional, and had still managed to leave the entire room destabilized. Your contacts at Pacific Mutual and Greenfield Partners, Conrad said. The ones with positions in infrastructure funds. You want me to make calls. I want you to have conversations about Pinnacle Capital, about whether a fund whose CEO becomes a public controversy mid-deal is the type of fund they want exposure to. A pause. Preston choosing his words carefully, which he rarely needed to do. I'll make some calls, he said. Discreet. Conrad, a flat note of mild offense. When am I not? Conrad hung up, looked at his phone for a moment, then dialed a different number, one he'd had for more than 20 years. Harrison Wolf had been a federal judge for 14 years. Before the bench, corporate counsel for 2 regional airlines, which was how Conrad had met him at an industry conference in Dallas in 1998. They'd discovered the same golf handicap and the same opinion about regulatory overreach and had been playing together on Thursdays ever since. Harrison's son had interned in Conrad's Park the summer after his sophomore year of college. Conrad had written the recommendation letter for Harrison's judicial appointment. These weren't favors. They were just how things worked between people who had known each other long enough. I may have a contract dispute coming through the federal docket, Conrad said when Harrison picked up. Airline infrastructure deal, if it crosses your courtroom. A silence on the line. I hear a lot of cases, Conrad. I know. Just wanted you to have context, in case it's useful. A longer silence. Conrad, Harrison said finally, you should be careful. I'm always careful. He hung up, turned to his window, the city below doing what cities do in the afternoon, moving, building, transacting, completely indifferent to the specific crisis unfolding on the 36th floor above it. Careful, yes, but also running out of moves he was comfortable making. He picked up the phone again and called his contact at ClearPath Analytics. Gave them specific instructions about what he needed and which systems he needed it from. Used the language they'd agreed on in previous engagements, but competitive intelligence F-review, market positioning assessment, which meant something different from what it said. After that call, he sat for a while. Quiet. 32 years. He had spent 32 years knowing which calls to make and when. Knowing which relationships held and which ones were transactional and which ones could be activated in moments like this one. That was the architecture of a career like his. Not just the work itself, the web of it. The accumulated weight of decades of right positioning. But something felt different this time. Elliot Hayes had sat in that conference room for 47 minutes and delivered a presentation from memory, without a single sheet of paper, and answered questions before they were fully asked. And then he had paused in the doorway and said, in the calmest possible voice, that the man removed from seat 1A had been him. And Margaret Doyle had asked him a question that Conrad hadn't seen coming, and Elliot had answered it in 2 words that somehow said everything. Conrad had spent 32 years learning how to read rooms. He sat at his desk and turned that moment over and felt, for the first time in as long as he could remember, something he didn't have a name for. Not quite fear, something that lived next door to it. Brenda Walsh drove home on autopilot, hands on the wheel. Eyes on the road, everything else somewhere else entirely. Cora was at her mother's. She'd pick her up tomorrow morning. Tonight the apartment would be quiet, which she usually liked, and tonight she was dreading because quiet meant thinking. And she had been thinking all day, and she could not find a way to arrange the facts of the morning into a shape that made her feel okay about herself. She made tea, didn't drink it, sat at the kitchen table and looked at her phone, 43 messages from colleagues. Most of them some variation of, did you see the video, and are you okay, and what's going to happen? 2 from her union rep, 1 from a number she didn't recognize. She had seen the video. She'd watched it 3 times in the parking lot of a grocery store before she could make herself drive home. Watched herself approach row 31. Watched the careful way Elliot Hayes had stood, the briefcase, the straight back, the walk down the aisle. First time she watched it, she felt sick. Second time, she felt something she couldn't name. Third time, she understood something she hadn't let herself feel until that moment. She had known what Comrade was asking her to do when he said it. She had known in the galley. She had told herself she was following operational procedure. Told herself there was context she didn't have. Told herself the things you tell yourself when you need to do what you've already decided to do. But she had known, and she'd done it anyway, and now 1,000,000 people had seen her do it, and tomorrow there would be more. She looked at the refrigerator. Cora's drawings held up by magnets, a horse with wings, a house with a disproportionately large sun, a self-portrait where Cora had given herself blue hair because she'd explained very seriously that's what she planned to have when she grew up, and had thought about Cora for a long time. Then she opened the Notes app on her phone, the one where she kept track of things that felt important, but that she didn't have anywhere else to put. She'd been keeping notes for months, not because she planned to use them, because some things are too heavy to carry only in your head, and she needed somewhere to put them down at the end of a shift. She had notes from 3 weeks ago, a crew briefing, Conrad's exact words about the premium protocols, the language he'd used, the way he'd said it, as though it were obvious, as though everyone in the room should already understand without being told directly. She scrolled through the notes, read them. Then she opened a new voice memo and pressed record. She started with the crew briefing. Date, location, who was present, what Conrad said. Word for word, as close as she could reconstruct it. Then she recorded the morning of the flight. Conrad pulling her aside, his exact instruction, the specific words. Then what happened in the cabin. Then Elliot Hayes standing in the aisle and the sound of Preston Ashford's voice and the security officers at the cabin entrance. She talked for 22 minutes. When she stopped, the apartment was very quiet. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long time, looking at Cora's drawings, thinking about her daughter and what it meant to show someone how to be a person by the choices you made when it cost you something. She found the number for Pinnacle Capital on their website, called it, got a voicemail for general inquiries, left her name and said she had information about the incident on Flight 2241 and could be reached at this number. Then she hung up and made fresh tea and waited to see what kind of person she was going to be. Elliot's phone rang at 7:40 that evening. Unknown number. He almost let it go, then something made him pick up. Mr. Hayes, a woman's voice. Careful, this is Brenda Walsh. He straightened his chair. Ms. Walsh, he said. Thank you for calling. A pause. He could hear her breathing, steadying herself. What they did was wrong, she said. It came out smaller than she intended. What Conrad told us to do. I knew it was wrong when he said it. I know. I went along with it anyway. I know that too. The line was quiet. Not uncomfortably. The way Lowy line is quiet when neither person needs to fill it. He's going to come after me, she said. If I say anything, probably. He has relationships all through that company. He does. So why would I? Because it happened to me, Elliot said. Quietly. Not performing anything. Just saying it. And it happened before me. And if nobody says anything, it will keep happening after. A pause. I won't tell you it's safe. It may not be. I can offer legal protection, and I will. But I can't promise it won't cost you something. She was quiet for a long moment. I have recordings, she said. Notes. There's a crew briefing from 3 weeks before your flight where Conrad laid out what he called the premium cabin protocol. His words on record. The quality of the silence on an Elliot's end changed. Don't send anything electronically, he said. Not yet. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow through a secure channel, and Ms. Walsh, he paused, chose his words carefully. What you do next is what defines this, not what you did this morning. She held the phone a long time after the call ended. Then she opened her notes and kept adding to them. 3 days after the flight, Owen filed Pinnacle's formal notice invoking the material adverse change clause. Falcon Air's legal team responded within 4 hours, which told Elliot everything about how prepared they'd been for it, with a motion for emergency federal hearing to compel release of the suspended funds. The argument was straightforward. A customer service incident did not constitute a material adverse change. The MAC clause was not designed to be weaponized as leverage in contract disputes. Pinnacle was in breach of its payment obligations. It was a reasonable argument. Owen spent 72 hours preparing for it anyway. On the morning before the hearing, he sat across from Elliot in the satellite office. They'd rented 2 blocks from the federal courthouse and said what he'd been working around for 2 days. "We have a problem with the judge." Elliot waited. Harrison Wolf, 14 years on the bench. His record on commercial contract disputes is by the book. Owen set a folder on the table. He and Conrad Hale have been members of the same private golf club for at least 12 years. Harrison's son interned at Falcon Air the summer before his junior year. Conrad Hale wrote his recommendation letter. The room was quiet. "We can file for recusal," Owen said. "On what grounds? Golf is not disqualifying. The internship is indirect and remote. We file and lose the motion. We've made an enemy of the man deciding our case, so we don't file. We build the record." Elliot looked at the folder. "Every argument we make completely. Every piece of evidence we submit with full documentation. Because if Wolf rules against us, and I think he will, I want a record so clean that the appeal is straightforward. And I want every journalist who covers this hearing to understand exactly what they're looking at." Owen was quiet for a moment. "You're planning to lose," he said. "I'm planning to be ready for it," Elliot said, which is different. That night, Elliot's phone rang at 11:47. Baltimore area code. He picked up on the first ring. "Mom, baby." Dorothy's voice was different, slower, softer at the edges. "Don't be scared when I tell you this." His stomach dropped through the floor. "Tell me." "I'm at Johns Hopkins." "My heart. They got me here in time, and it's stable." They're saying it's stable, but Elliot, he was already standing. Already reaching for his jacket with his free hand. "I'm coming," he said. "Right now. Don't say anything else. I'm coming." "You don't have to." "Mom, silence." "Oh, he said. He was at the Houston airport by 12:30. On a plane by 1:15. In a Baltimore cab by 4:20 in the morning, watching the city he grew up in slide past in the dark. The shape of a bridge he'd crossed on his bike as a teenager. The particular orange of the streetlights on the east side. The way the road felt familiar under the wheels before his mind quite caught up with where he was. The hospital smelled the way hospitals smell. Dorothy was in a room on the 4th floor, smaller than he remembered, which was wrong because she was exactly the same size she'd always been. But people in hospital beds always look smaller. He didn't know why that was. He'd never found a way to stop noticing it. He sat in the chair next to her bed, held her hand, listened to the monitor. The steady, reliable beep of it, the specific comfort of a sound that means the heart is still doing its work. She opened her eyes at 5:40 in the morning, looked at him, didn't seem surprised. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She looked at him the way she always looked at him when she was deciding between the easier thing and the real thing. She chose the real thing, she always did. "Don't stop," she said. Her hand tightened on his, still strong, still Dorothy. "Not because of me. Because of the people who don't have what you have. Who'll get on a plane someday, and somebody will try to move them, and they'll need to know somebody did it first and didn't let it go." She looked at him steadily. "You be that person, Elliot. You have always been that person." He didn't say anything for a while. Outside the window, Baltimore was beginning to get light. That early morning gray when the sky hasn't decided yet. He'd watched it from this city his whole childhood. Different windows, same light. "I'm scared," he said, finally. At 5:40 in the morning in a hospital room, where those words were allowed. "Not of losing the case, of the cost of all of it, on the people around me." Dorothy squeezed his hand. "Being scared and doing it anyway," she said, "is the whole thing. That's always been the whole thing." He stayed until the cardiologist came in at 8 and used words like stable and managed and monitoring with a reassuring precision of someone who had delivered this version of this speech many times. Until Dorothy told him firmly to go eat something and stop hopping over her like a lost bird. Until the morning had fully committed to being morning. He bought terrible coffee from the machine in the hallway, stood against the wall outside her room and drank it. Then he called Renee. "How's your mom?" she said first. "Stable. She'll be okay." He paused. "What happened overnight?" "A beat. Clearpath made a move while you were in the air." Her voice was careful, precise. The way it got when the news was serious, but she'd already started working the problem. They accessed the client relationship database, institutional investors, contact information, portfolio positions. Elliot was very still. They're going to target the clients. Already started. Preston Ashford called Greenfield Partners this morning at 7:15. We have the call log from a contact inside that firm. He suggested that Pinnacle's principles were, his word, emotionally volatile in ways that created investment risk. Emotionally volatile. There it was. The oldest move. You can't challenge the argument, so you challenge the person making it. You can't undermine the numbers, so you undermine the state of mind of the man who built them. You raise questions in quiet rooms, plant seeds with the right people, never say anything direct. Just ask carefully whether someone is really as stable as they appear. Elliot stood in the hallway of Johns Hopkins Hospital, terrible coffee in hand, the sound of the floor waking up around him, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel yet through any of it. Through the flight, and the meeting and the invoking of the Mac clause, and the midnight call from Baltimore and the cab ride through the dark. Not anger. He'd had that in controlled amounts, directed. This was colder than anger, more useful than anger. Renee, he said. Yeah. The honeypot files, have they been accessed? Keys clicking, 3 folders. Accessed through the ClearPath breach point. Timestamped 2:17 AIM. Good, he finished the coffee, set the cup on a passing cart. Then we have them documented and traced. Hold everything. Don't move on it yet. He pushed off the wall, started walking toward the elevator, and get me a meeting with the production team at the news magazine program. The one that's been covering airline discrimination for the last 18 months. They've called twice since the video went viral. I know. Now call them back. He rode the elevator down, walked through the lobby, shushed through the hospital doors into the Baltimore morning. His mother was going to be okay. The hearing was in 4 days. He was going to lose it, and none of it, was going to stop what came next. The hearing lasted 1 day. Falcon Air's attorneys were good. Sharp, prepared, and smart enough to stay on their strongest ground, contract law. Not discrimination. Not what happened on the plane. Just the contract. Just the numbers. Just the question of whether a passenger being asked to change seats constituted grounds for withholding $25 million already committed under a binding preliminary agreement. They built their case cleanly. Elliot had invoked the Mac clause, they argued, not because Falcon Air had experienced any material adverse change in its business condition, but because Elliot Hayes had experienced a personal inconvenience and chosen to weaponize a contractual mechanism as retaliation. This was not what the clause was designed for. This was leverage disguised as principle. It was a reasonable argument. Owen Garrett had spent 72 hours preparing to dismantle it anyway. He walked the court through the documented sequence. The boarding pass, checked 3 times. The badge numbers Elliot had recorded. The luggage reroute notification timestamped to 7:52 a.m., while the plane was still airborne, and the internal Falcon Air email, obtained through Discovery with the initials C. H in the authorization field, the social media spread. The 4 prior discrimination complaints settled under NDA during Conrad Hale's tenure as VP of Operations. Then Owen moved to introduce Brenda Walsh's testimony. Falcon Air's attorneys objected before he finished the sentence. Her employment contract contained an arbitration clause, they argued. Any disputes arising from conduct within the scope of her employment had to go through Falcon Air's internal arbitration process before reaching a federal court. Her testimony here was procedurally improper. Judge Harrison Wolf considered this for approximately 40 seconds. Sustained. Owen tried a different route. The crew briefing recordings. Brenda's audio documentation of Conrad laying out the premium cabin protocols 3 weeks before Elliot's flight. He moved to enter them into evidence. Authentication issues, Wolf said. Insufficient chain of custody. The recordings had been made on a personal device without proper documentation of the circumstances. Excluded. Owen fought each ruling carefully, preserved every objection on the record, made sure every argument was fully stated so that no appellate court could later say this if the point hadn't been raised. He did this with the methodical patience of a man who had understood from the first conversation in the satellite's office that today was not the day they were going to win. But he made them work for it. He made them earn every ruling. Wolf delivered his decision from the bench without waiting for a written opinion. The MAC clause, as says, was a mechanism designed to protect parties from fundamental changes in business conditions, not from customer service disputes, however unfortunate. Pinnacle Capital had failed to demonstrate that the events on Flight 2241 constituted a material adverse change to the basis of the investment relationship. The suspension of funds was not legally justified. Pinnacle was ordered to release the escrowed $25 million immediately, plus interest accrued during the suspension period. The suspension claims, Wolf added in language that read like it had been drafted by someone else entirely, appeared to be opportunistic leverage tactics rather than good-faith legal arguments. Opportunistic leverage tactics. Elliot sat at the plaintiff's table and wrote those 3 words in his notepad, neatly. Then he set the pen down and looked at them. Around him, Falcon Air's legal team was carefully not celebrating. The professional version of celebration, quiet nods, papers being organized with slightly more briskness than necessary, a brief exchange of eye contact that said what it needed to say. Across the gallery, Conrad Hale sat in the second row with the expression of a man who had just watched something go exactly as he'd arranged for it to go. Owen leaned over, low. Every argument is documented, the appeal. I know, Elliot said. He stood, buttoned his jacket, shook Owen's hand, then turned and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Conrad. Not because he was avoiding it, because Conrad had already had enough of his attention today. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Falcon Air's PR team had arranged Gerald Moros at a small cluster of microphones. Gerald made a statement about vindication and the importance of honoring contractual commitments and his confidence in Falcon Air's processes. Conrad stood just behind him, hands clasped, expression of gracious magnanimity that sat awkwardly on a face not built for it. Elliot and Owen got into their car without stopping. Back at the satellite office, Owen sat across from Elliot and waited. Elliot looked at the table for a moment. "How long until the full hearing record is public?" he said. "End of week. 5 days. The excluded evidence, Brenda's testimony, the audio recordings, none of that is under seal." "Correct. Wolf excluded it from this proceeding. He didn't seal it. It exists. It's documentable. And 3 investigative journalists are already on record requesting the full case file the moment it's released." Elliot nodded slowly. "And the honeypot data from ClearPath Access? Traced, documented, verified, ready when we need it. Then we wait 5 days." He looked up, and then we stopped waiting. He flew back to Baltimore that night. Not because the case required it. Because Dorothy was still in the hospital, and he had not yet sat with her long enough. Had not yet let himself just be her son for more than an hour at a stretch without the case pulling at him from the edges. He arrived at the hospital at 9:30. The floor was quiet in the way hospital floors are quiet at night. Not silent, but subdued. The particular hum of equipment, soft footsteps, the occasional sound of a door. Dorothy was awake, sitting up slightly, which the nurses had apparently been encouraging. She looked better than she had 2 days ago. More herself, the color in her face returning. She looked at him when he came in. "You lost," she said. "News travels." I had television on. She gestured at the set mounted on the wall, currently dark. "They said Falcon Air won the court case." "They won the hearing," he said. He sat down in the chair, but beside her bed. "Different thing." She studied him. "You don't look like a man who lost. I look like a man who's tired." "Those aren't the same thing either." He almost smiled. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about things that had nothing to do with Falcon Air. His nephew's baseball team, a book Dorothy had been reading before the hospital, a conversation she'd had with her neighbor about the garden that had somehow turned into a 3-day disagreement about tomatoes. Normal things, the texture of a life being lived. He needed that, more than he'd known until he was sitting in it. When she started to get drowsy, he stood. "Elliot," she said. "Yeah, when it's over, whatever it looks like, when it's over, you come home and you eat a meal at my table." She looked at him steadily. "That's all I'm asking." "Deal," he said. He kissed her forehead, turned off the lamp by her bed, walked out into the hallway, stewed against the wall for a moment. Then he called Thomas. His son picked up on the third ring, slightly breathless in the way 9-year-olds are breathless when they've been running around doing something that seemed very important. "Dad. Hey, bud. You busy? I was building something. Can I call you back?" Elliot looked at the floor, at the linoleum, at the particular scuff marks that accumulate on hospital floors and that nobody ever quite gets around to fixing. "Yeah," he said. "Call me back whenever." "Okay." A pause. Then, because Thomas had been watching the news at his mother's house and had seen something he didn't fully understand. "Dad, are you okay?" Elliot breathed in, slow. "I'm okay," he said. "I'll go build your thing. Okay, love you." "Love you too, bud." He hung up, stood in the hallway for another minute. Then he straightened, put the phone in his pocket, and walked toward the elevator. 5 days. The program aired on a Sunday, 8 o'clock Eastern, the kind of time slot that meant the producers believed in the story, that they'd looked at what they had and decided it deserved the full weight of a Sunday night, when the week hadn't started pressing back in yet and people were willing to sit with something real. Elliot watched from his hotel room in Houston, alone, the way he'd wanted it. Renee had offered to come over. Owen had suggested they watch together at the satellite office. He'd thanked them both. Ordered room service he didn't eat. Sat in the chair by the window and waited. The program opened without fanfare. Just a fact, stated plain by the anchor. A black executive was removed from his confirmed first-class seat on a commercial airline last month to accommodate a white passenger who held no first-class ticket. The airline called it a customer service adjustment. The executive called it something else. And what the investigation found, the truth was more systematic than either description. Then Brenda Walsh appeared on screen. She looked like herself, not performed, not overcomposed. She looked like a woman who had decided what she was going to say and was saying it. Hands folded in her lap, voice steady, carrying underneath it the slight tremor of someone who knows the cost of the words as they come out. She described the crew briefing from 3 weeks before Elliot's flight. The policy, she used that word deliberately, because it was Conrad's word, for managing what he called cabin demographics on premium routes. The instruction to verify certain passengers more thoroughly than others, the specific language he'd used, which she quoted directly. Passengers who don't present consistent with the premium cabin profile. She described the morning of the flight, Conrad finding her in the galley, his exact words. Then the program played the audio. Conrad Hale's voice, clear, unhurried. The voice of a man who had said this kind of thing enough times that it had stopped requiring care. "You know what I'm asking, Brenda. The premium cabin has a standard. You understand what that means. If a passenger doesn't fit that standard, you find a reason. That's what the verification protocol is for." The cabin went quiet around the television, which was not a cabin at all but a hotel room in Houston, where one man sat in an armchair and watched the screen without moving. Then the second clip. The crew briefing 3 weeks prior. I'm not going to spell it out because I don't need to. You've all been doing this long enough. When a VIP needs accommodation, you accommodate them. Everything else is flexible. The ticketed seat is flexible. The assigned row is flexible. The only thing that isn't flexible is making sure our premium passengers have the environment they expect. The environment they expect. Elliot had heard these recordings before. His team had listened to them and transcribed them and sourced them. He knew them. But hearing them played into the air of a Sunday night in an empty hotel room, with the anchor saying quietly afterward that Falcon Air had declined to comment, something settled in him. Hard, clear, permanent. This was real, documented, and now it existed in the public record in a way that no court ruling could touch. His phone started during the first commercial break. He turned it face down on the table and kept watching. The second half of the program was harder. 4 other passengers, different flights, different years, same airline, same pattern. A woman from Atlanta asked to move from her assigned seat without explanation. A physician subjected to what he described as a targeted additional security review on 3 consecutive Falcon Air flights before he switched carriers. A retired school teacher who had requested wheelchair assistance and been left on the jetway for 40 minutes while other passengers reboarded around her. A businessman who had filed a complaint and received a settlement and signed a document he had believed prevented him from ever speaking about it again. The program had spent 4 weeks with their attorneys working through the specific language of those agreements. The settlements covered the individual's incidents. They did not cover the pattern. They did not cover the policy. They did not cover a systemic culture operating under official protection. So they were speaking, and their faces on television, unhurried, clear, dignified, made visible something that had been easy to look away from for a very long time. Elliot turned the program off at 9:52. Before the final segment, he knew how it ended. He'd worked with the producers for 6 weeks. He didn't need to watch the conclusion tonight. He sat in the quiet for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called Dorothy. She answered on the second ring. He could hear the television in the background, just being switched off. "Baby," she said. "Hey." A long pause, the comfortable kind, the kind between two people who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't require filling. "You did right," she said finally. "Not you won, not you did good. You did right. I didn't do it alone," he said. "No, but you started it." A pause, that's not a small thing. He looked out the window. Houston at night. The scatter of lights that a city makes when you're up high enough to see it spread. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Better. Cardiologist says I can go home Tuesday." A brief pause. "Stop worrying about me. That's not something that's going to happen." She made the sound she made when she was trying not to laugh, soft through the nose. "Go to sleep," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She was right about that. By Monday morning, Falcon Air's stock had opened down 17%. By Tuesday, it was down 23%. Gerald Morrow issued a statement Monday afternoon. It called the program one-sided and the reporting incomplete. It affirmed Falcon Air's commitment to all passengers and its pride in its customer service record. It was drafted by communications team and was in terms of containing the damage, approximately as effective as a screen door in a rainstorm. Because by Monday afternoon, the journalist who had been waiting for the full court record had published their analysis. And the analysis included documents that had been submitted into evidence and then excluded by Judge Wolf. And those documents included 2 years of internal Falcon Air communications about cabin management on premium routes. And buried in those communications, dated 16 months earlier, was a memo signed by Gerald Morrow, not Conrad. Gerald, the memo was addressed to senior cabin operations staff, subject to premium route experience optimization. Its contents in carefully bureaucratic language describe protocols for managing the passenger composition on high-value routes during periods of high demand. The language was dense. It had been written to say something without stitching it plainly. But journalists were trained for precisely that kind of language. They said it plainly in their reporting. The discrimination policy attributed to Conrad Hale, to one rogue executive acting outside company values, had a paper trail leading directly to his CEO. Gerald Morrow resigned on Wednesday morning. He issued a statement describing his decision as a desire to allow the company to move without detraction, which was once to describe being shown the door by a board that had watched their market capitalization drop nearly $250 million in 5 days. Conrad, in contrast, did not resign. Conrad fought. He convened a meeting on the 36th floor with the 4 board members he considered most aligned with his position. Laid out his case with the calm precision of a man who had been building arguments his entire professional life. "This is a coordinated attack," he told them. "Hayes, plan this from before the flight. Book a first-class seat on a company you're negotiating with. Create a confrontation. Use it to apply pressure for governance concessions you couldn't get at the table. The video, the program, the frozen payment, it's all part of the same strategy." Sandra Reeves, the board member he'd least wanted in the room, looked at him without expression. "The audio recordings, Conrad," she said. "Your voice, taken out of context, edited. The crew briefing recording is 22 minutes long." He changed direction. "Hayes is a sophisticated financial operator with a history of taking aggressive positions in distressed companies. Look at his acquisition record. Look at what Pinnacle has done in rail and logistics. He's not an investor. He's a hostile actor using civil rights language as cover." "That's an interesting theory," Sandra said. "Do you have evidence?" "The pattern. The audio is your voice giving explicit instructions to treat a passenger differently based on his appearance. That's the pattern I'm looking at." Conrad looked around the table. The other 3 board members were looking at their papers. He understood them then. Not gradually, all at once. The way you understand something when the evidence has been building for days and you've been choosing not to look directly at it. He stood, walked out, took the elevator back to his office, sat at his desk, and made the decision that cost him everything. He didn't know about the security camera upgrade. 8 months earlier, Falcon Air's insurance carrier had required expanded coverage in executive offices as a condition of renewing the company's directors and officers policy. The decision had been documented in a facilities memo that went to building operations, not to Conrad specifically. So when he opened his email and began moving things, pulling up correspondence, selecting folders, dragging them to the trash, opening files, and highlighting and pressing delete with the focused efficiency a man who had decided this was the move and was committing to it. He did it in full view of a camera mounted near the air vent above the east wall of his office. Resolution, high definition, timestamp, active and running. The FBI had obtained a warrant for the building's security footage as a component of their investigation into unauthorized system access and potential witness tampering. The warrant had been executed 2 days before Conrad sat down at his keyboard. The footage was reviewed within 48 hours of collection. 4 minutes and 27 seconds. Obstruction of justice. That charge superseded everything else. Not because the other things weren't real. The discrimination pattern was documented. The clear path access was traced. The witness pressure on Brenda was recorded. Those things would matter in what came later. But obstructions was immediate, unambiguous. Captured in high definition by a camera Conrad had not known existed, in a room he had believed was private. The board voted on Friday. 1 abstention, 11 votes for termination with cause. Conrad Hale was no longer employed by Falcon Air as of 5:47 p.m. 32 years after he'd walked into the company as a ground operations coordinator with his grandfather's aviation stories in his head and his father's connections in his back pocket, and a belief, never examined and therefore never questioned, that certain spaces belonged to certain people, and his job was to maintain that order. He left through the parking garage. No statement, no cameras. Just a man in a good suit, a box of desk items to his car in the fluorescent quiet of a concrete structure, alone in the specific way that people are alone when they've just lost the thing that organized their identity. Preston Ashford read about it online that evening. He was at his club. He folded his phone face down on the table, looked out the window at the lawn, ordered another drink, said nothing to anyone. Within the week, he had quietly stepped down from 3 of the 4 corporate boards he sat on. No announcement, no explanation, just a brief notification to each board's secretary that he would be reducing his external commitments. Nobody called to ask why. 3 weeks after the signing, Elliot stood in a conference room on the 12th floor of Falcon Air headquarters, the training floor, not the executive suite, and looked out at 34 people. Cabin crew, ground staff, gate agents, a handful of mid-level operations managers. The first cohort of what the new agreement required Falcon Air to call the Accountability and Standards Initiative. Bureaucratic name. Simple purpose. A conversation about what it costs to individuals and to institutions when you look through someone. Elliot wasn't there to lecture. He pulled a chair over from the side wall, set it facing the group, sat down. I'm going to tell you what it felt like to walk that aisle, he said. Not the legal version, the real one. He talked for 20 minutes, without notes, without the professional composure that had carried him through the past 2 months. He talked about the weight of it, the familiarity of it, the specific exhaustion of being seen as something other than what you are across a lifetime, in room after room. He talked about what that costs, not in money, in energy, in the labor of having to prove yourself in spaces where others simply arrive. He talked about his mother, about Baltimore, about the morning he sat beside her hospital bed at 5:40 in the morning and told her he was scared, and she told him that being scared and doing it anyway was the whole thing. He talked about Brenda Walsh, about what it means to know something is wrong and do it anyway, and what it means to decide later that you're not willing to carry the silence on top of it. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are actually listening. Not politely, actually. When he finished, a woman near the back raised her hand. Mid-30s, ground operations, 6 years with the company. What do we do, she said, when we're told to do something we know is wrong? Elliot looked at her. You have 2 choices, he said. You do it and you carry it, or you don't and you face what comes from that. A pause. The second one is harder. I can't promise there won't be a cost, but the first one has a cost too. It's just paid differently and over a longer time and mostly in private. She wrote something in her notebook. Someone else asked a question. Then another. The session ran 40 minutes over its scheduled time. Margaret Doyle, standing in the back of the room, let it run. The Hayes Initiative launched 6 weeks after the signing, a nonprofit organization. Legal support and professional development for minority executives in the domestic transportation sector. Specific by design, not a broad diversity fund, but something targeted at the exact gaps Elliot had spent his career navigating. $8 million in initial funding. His money, not Pinnacle's, his own. Because some things need to come from a person, not a strategy. 22 participants in the first cohort. Aviation, rail, logistics, mid-level professionals, all qualified, all hitting ceilings with no official name. Elliot interviewed each one personally, not to assess them, to hear them. He asked every one of them the same question at the end of every interview. What do you know that nobody's asked you yet? The answers kept him awake for days, in the way that makes you understand how much is sitting there, ready, waiting for someone to ask. On the morning of his first flight, as a member of Falcon Air's ethics committee, Elliot arrived at the gate 35 minutes early. Old habit. He was flying to Chicago, 2 hours. A committee session on the new external complaint review process, the first one under the restructured governance framework. He'd booked the flight himself, through the standard booking system, as any passenger would, seat 1A. Same as always. He boarded with the first-class group, walked down the jetway, stepped into the aircraft. The flight attendant, someone he didn't recognize, someone who had not been there 6 months ago, looked up. Smiled, genuinely. The kind of smile that isn't working at anything, just is. "Good morning," she said. "Can I get you something before we push back?" "Coffee, please." I said, "Thank you." He settled into the seat, stowed his bag, took out his laptop, opened the committee agenda. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas. "Dad, can I come see you this weekend?" He looked at those 7 words for a moment. Then he typed back, "Yes, I'll come to you. We'll do whatever you want." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Can we go to the Science Museum?" He sat with that for a second. 9 years old, still building things, still asking. Yes, he typed. "Absolutely. I'll be there Saturday morning." He put the phone in his pocket. The flight attendant brought his coffee, in a proper cup, with a sleeve and a lid and a small packet of sugar on the side that he didn't need but appreciated the gesture of. He held it for a moment, just the warmth of it. Outside the window, the tarmac was pale in the early light. Ground crew moving with purpose in the gray. A luggage cart making a wide arc between 2 aircraft. The ordinary morning machinery of an airport doing what airports do. 6 months ago, in this same seat on this airline, a man had looked at Elliot Hayes and made a calculation. Had decided that one person's comfort was worth more than another person's dignity. Had set in motion a sequence of events he believed he had the architecture to contain. What Conrad Hale had not understood was that you cannot move someone who has already decided where they stand. You can make them walk to row 31. You cannot make them stop. The aircraft door closed, the engines built from a low hum to ready. The flight attendant made her announcement. The jetway retracted. The plane began to move. Elliot closed his laptop, put it away, looked out the window instead. The runway stretched ahead. The engines rose. And Elliot Hayes, 44 years old, son of Dorothy who worked nights and never complained, Flav Thomas who wanted to go to the Science Museum on Saturday, CEO of Pinnacle Capital, ethics committee member of Falcon Air, man who had walked an aisle as in a slightly wrinkled suit and decided with full clarity exactly who he was going to be. Felt the wheels leave the ground, and rose.